Some moments brand themselves into your soul through sheer pain. XT Group. Omega stood frozen at the edge of the grand banquet hall, watching her ex-fiancé Eric toast his new bride, her former best friend Lissa, while 300 nobles laughed and cheered. The crystal chandeliers above cast dancing shadows across marble floors, but all she could see was the empty chair beside her at table 17, the reject table, where broken engagements went to die publicly. TV tropes. Every laugh felt like a blade. Every pitying glance from the crowd reminded her she'd been replaced, discarded, humiliated in front of the entire kingdom's elite. Eric had sent the invitation himself, a twisted courtesy, he'd called it. "You should move on, Omega. Come celebrate with us." She should have stayed home, but here she was, dressed in midnight blue silk her mother had sewn by hand, sitting alone while the woman who'd stolen her future wore the wedding crown that should have been hers. The whispers slithered through the hall like poison. Poor thing. He traded up. What did she expect, being so ordinary? Omega's fingers trembled around her wine glass. She wouldn't cry. Not here. Not in front of them. Omega wasn't nobility. Not by blood, anyway. Her parents were artisan craftspeople in the lower quarter. Her father, a master woodworker. Her mother, a seamstress whose embroidery was sought after by merchants across 3 provinces. They'd given her everything they had. Education, opportunity, and a gift that set her apart from every other commoner in the kingdom. TV tropes. She could read old lycan. The ancient runic language had been dead for centuries, preserved only in crumbling texts locked away in the royal archives where Omega worked as a junior archivist. While other girls her age learned dancing and etiquette, she'd spent countless hours deciphering prophecies, treaties, and forgotten histories written in symbols most scholars couldn't even recognize anymore. Eric had loved that about her once. He'd been a low-ranking diplomat's son, ambitious and charming, and he'd courted her for 2 years with promises of a life built together. She'd believed every word. She'd introduced him to her work, shared her discoveries, let him into her world. Then he'd met Lisa at a summer festival. Lisa, whose father was a high council member, whose dowry could buy Eric the political connections he'd always craved. The betrayal had been swift and surgical. 1 month, Omega was planning a modest wedding. The next, she was receiving a formal letter ending their engagement, followed by an invitation to his new wedding 3 months later. The cruelty was the point. The hall fell silent so suddenly that Omega thought she'd imagined it. JXT Group. She looked up from her untouched plate to see the crowd parting like a sea, their faces shifting from celebration to shock. And then she saw him, towering, cloaked in shadow-black velvet, his presence filling the room like a gathering storm. The Beast King. Theon Ashmar, ruler of the northern reaches, whose legend preceded him like thunder. They said he was immortal, cursed or blessed depending on who told the story. They said he'd ruled for 3 centuries, watching kingdoms rise and fall while he remained unchanged. They said he rarely left his fortress, and when he did, it meant war or alliance, never something as trivial as a noble wedding. Yet here he was, moving through the banquet hall with predatory grace, his silver eyes scanning the room until they locked directly onto hers. Omega's breath caught. The Beast King was walking straight toward table 17, toward her. The entire hall watched in paralyzed silence as he reached her table and, without a word, pulled out the empty chair beside her and sat down. His presence was overwhelming. Ancient power barely contained beneath human skin, though rumors claimed his true form was far less human when provoked. "Pretend you came with me," he said quietly, his voice like gravel and silk. Omega stared at him, unable to form words. Was this real? Was the Beast King actually sitting beside her at the reject table, in front of everyone? What? She managed. His lips curved into something that might have been a smile. "Your ex-fiancé is watching, as is everyone else. So let's give them something to talk about besides your humiliation, shall we?" Before she could respond, he raised his hand, and a servant immediately rushed over with wine. Theon lifted his glass toward the high table where Eric and Lissa sat frozen in shock. "To the happy couple," Theon announced, his voice carrying across the silent hall. "May your marriage be exactly what you both deserve." The double meaning wasn't lost on anyone. Nervous laughter rippled through the crowd as nobles scrambled to raise their glasses, terrified of offending the Beast King. Eric's face had gone pale. Lissa looked like she might faint. Omega felt something shift inside her chest. A spark of vindication, of power she'd forgotten she could feel. "Why are you doing this?" she whispered. Theon's silver eyes met hers, and for a moment she saw something ancient and sad beneath the legendary exterior. Because, he said softly, I know what it's like to be alone in a room full of people who think you're a monster. The music started again, cautiously, as if the musicians weren't sure whether they were allowed to continue. Conversations resumed in hushed, frantic whispers, but all eyes remained on Table 17, where the Beast King sat beside the forgotten ex-fiancé like it was the most natural thing in the world. GXT group. Tell me about your work, Theon said, leaning back in his chair with casual confidence that made Omega's heart race. You're an archivist, aren't you? Specializing in old lycan texts. She blinked. How do you know that? I make it my business to know interesting people, he replied. And anyone who can read the old prophecies is very interesting indeed. There aren't 5 people left in this kingdom who can decipher those runes properly. Despite herself, Omega felt her professional pride stir. 4, actually. 2 of the supposed experts are frauds who memorize common passages and fake the rest. Theon's laugh was genuine, drawing more stares. I knew I liked you. Tell me, what do you make of the convergence prophecy? The one about the immortal and the catalyst? Omega's breath hitched. That prophecy was obscure, buried in texts most people didn't even know existed. The fact that he knew about it meant he'd either lived long enough to see it written or cared enough to study it. It's incomplete, she said carefully. The final stanza was damaged centuries ago, but what remains suggests that immortality carries a price that can only be balanced by mortality, that power without end requires wisdom that understands endings. Theon's expression shifted, something vulnerable flickering across his face. An elegant interpretation. It's just academic theory. Nothing about prophecy is just academic, he interrupted gently. Trust me. I've lived long enough to see several come true. Before Omega could respond, the orchestra shifted into a waltz. Couples flooded the dance floor, and she felt a spike of anxiety. Dancing had never been her strength. Eric used to mock her for it privately, calling her clumsy, saying she had 2 left feet. Theon stood and extended his hand. Dance with me. It wasn't a question, but it wasn't a command either. It was an invitation that somehow felt like a lifeline. I'm not very good, she admitted, her voice small. Neither am I, he lied kindly. We'll be terrible together. She took his hand. The moment they stepped onto the dance floor, every other couple gave them space, creating a wide circle as if afraid to get too close to the Beast King. Theon guided her through the steps with surprising gentleness, his hand firm at her waist, steadying her when she stumbled. And she did stumble. Twice. In the first minute, her nerves making her feet forget the pattern. But each time, Theon caught her effortlessly, his immortal reflexes making it look like part of the dance. I've got you, he murmured. Always. The word always hit differently when spoken by someone who'd lived for centuries. As they moved across the floor, Omega became aware of the shift happening around them. People weren't just staring anymore. They were reconsidering, whispering new narratives. If the Beast King himself had chosen to sit with her, to dance with her, then maybe she wasn't the pathetic abandoned girl they'd assumed. Maybe there was more to her story. The dance ended, but Theon didn't release her immediately. For a heartbeat, they stood there, his silver eyes searching hers like he was trying to solve a puzzle written in her soul. Then Eric appeared beside them, his diplomatic smile plastered on too tight. Your Majesty, Eric said with a bow that barely masked his fury. What an unexpected honor. I didn't realize you knew my former fiancé. The temperature around them dropped 10 degrees. Theon's expression didn't change, but something predatory entered his posture. TV tropes. I know her now, Theon said with deadly calm. And I find her far more captivating than anything else at this celebration. Tell me, diplomat's son, do you often invite people you've discarded to witness your happiness? Or is cruelty a new hobby? Eric's face flushed red. Several nearby nobles took a step back, sensing danger. I meant no disrespect, Eric stammered. I simply thought, you thought wrong. Theon cut him off, his voice like ice. Enjoy your wedding, Eric. I suspect it will be the last time anyone finds you interesting. He turned back to Omega, offering his arm. Shall we take some air? This room has become rather suffocating. Omega took his arm without hesitation, leaving Eric standing humiliated on the dance floor. Poetic justice she'd never dared imagine. The palace gardens were quieter, cooler, illuminated by floating lanterns that cast gentle light across flowering vines and stone pathways. Omega breathed deeply, finally allowing herself to process what had just happened inside. Descript. Thank you, she said quietly. You didn't have to do that. Theon walked beside her, his hands clasped behind his back. Actually, I did. I have a particular hatred for those who inflict unnecessary pain on others. Cruelty for sport disgusts me. You're immortal and powerful, Omega said, studying his profile. You could crush people like Eric without effort, but you don't. Why? He was silent for a long moment, staring at a fountain where water cascaded over carved stone wolves. Because I've lived long enough to understand that power without restraint creates only monsters, and I've spent 3 centuries trying very hard not to become one, despite what people call me, the Beast King. Yes, his smile was bitter. A title earned in my youth, when I was less controlled. I've tried to atone, but legends are harder to kill than men. People fear me because it's easier than knowing me. Omega felt an unexpected kinship with that loneliness. Different in scale, perhaps, but familiar in shape. I understand that. Being known for one thing, one mistake, one moment, and never being allowed to be anything else. Theon looked at her then, really looked at her, and she saw recognition in his ancient eyes. What would you prefer to be called? She asked impulsively. If you could choose? He seemed surprised by the question, as if no one had asked in decades. My name is Theon. I'd settle for that. Theon, Omega repeated, testing it. It felt less like a legend and more like a person. I'm Omega, not the abandoned girl, not the ordinary archivist. Just Omega. Just Omega, he echoed. And the way he said her name made it sound like something precious. They walked in comfortable silence until they reached a secluded alcove filled with night-blooming flowers. Theon turned to face her, his expression serious. I'd like to see you again, he said. Tomorrow. Properly. Not as a rescue mission, but because I find your mind fascinating and your company refreshing. Would you consider having dinner with me? Omega's heart hammered. This was real. The Beast King, Theon, was asking to see her again. Yes, she breathed. I'd like that. The next morning, Omega was still floating on impossible hope when Eric appeared at the archives, his expression cold. JXT Group, I'm warning you as a courtesy, he said without preamble. Stay away from the Beast King. You don't understand what you're getting into. Omega set down the manuscript she'd been cataloging. That's not your concern anymore, Eric. You made sure of that. He's using you, Eric insisted. People like him don't fall for people like us. You're a novelty, Omega, a curiosity. When he gets bored, he'll discard you just like... Eric's face twisted with something ugly. Don't come crying to me when you realize I was right. He left, but his words planted seeds of doubt that Omega couldn't quite shake. Was this real? Could someone like Theon actually be interested in her? Or was she just a momentary distraction from his immortal loneliness? That evening, dinner with Theon both calmed and complicated those fears. He'd arranged for them to dine in a private garden pavilion, with Omega's elderly mentor, Professor Mira, acting as chaperone, a gesture of propriety that showed he cared about her. Reputation. They talked for hours, about prophecies and history, about loneliness and loss, about what it meant to live in a world that constantly changed around you. Theon spoke about outliving everyone he'd ever cared for. Omega spoke about feeling invisible in a society that valued bloodlines over brilliance. And with every shared story, every laugh, every moment of understanding, Omega felt the impossible becoming possible. 2 weeks later, Theon invited Omega to his northern fortress, a massive structure of black stone and silver banners that overlooked mountain peaks touching the clouds. CBR. They stood on a balcony as stars emerged overhead, and Theon's expression was more vulnerable than she'd ever seen it. I need to tell you something, he said quietly. Something that will change how you see this. Us. If there's going to be an us. Omega's stomach tightened. Tell me. Immortality isn't a gift, Omega. It's a curse dressed as power. I don't age, I don't die. But everyone I've ever loved does. Every friend, every ally, every fleeting connection, I watch them grow old and fade, while I remain unchanged. For 3 centuries, I've isolated myself to avoid that pain. He turned to face her, his silver eyes reflecting starlight. But then I met you, and for the first time in longer than I can measure, I felt something other than loneliness. You see me? Not the legend, not the power, just me. And I'm terrified because if I let myself love you, I'll eventually lose you, too. But if I don't, I'll lose you anyway, right now, to fear. Omega's breath caught. This was the moment. The choice point where she could walk away safe or step forward into something beautiful and heartbreaking and real. CBR. I'm mortal, she said slowly. I'll age and change and eventually die. That's my truth. But you know what I've learned from studying ancient texts? The prophecies never promise happy endings. They promise meaningful ones. Maybe the point isn't to avoid pain. Maybe it's to choose connection anyway, knowing it won't last forever, but will matter completely while it does. She stepped closer, taking his hands in hers. I'm choosing you, Theon. All of you. And yes, it's scary, and probably foolish, and definitely complicated. But let's be scared together. Let's discover what this could be, knowing exactly what it costs. Theon's expression shifted through a dozen emotions before settling on something like wonder. You're sure? I'm terrified, Omega admitted with a shaky laugh. But I'm sure. He kissed her then, gentle and reverent and full of 3 centuries of loneliness finally finding its opposite. Then let's discover it together, he whispered against her lips. Whatever time we have, let's make it matter. News of the Beast King's courtship spread through the kingdom like wildfire. Suddenly, Omega found herself thrust into political waters she'd never learned to navigate. XT Group Theon's court was divided. Some saw her as a fascinating addition, a scholar queen who could balance the king's raw power with intellectual wisdom. Others saw her as a commoner interloper with no business standing beside immortal royalty. Chief among the opposition was Lady Seraphina, a high-ranking noble who'd spent decades positioning herself as Theon's most logical political match. She began a whisper campaign, suggesting that Omega was manipulating the king, using forbidden magic or prophecies to ensnare him. Professor Mira became Omega's unlikely champion, teaching her court etiquette and political strategy. They'll try to make you small, the old woman warned. Don't let them. You belong here not despite your origins, but because of them. You earned your place through merit, not birthright. Theon's public courtship was deliberate and unmistakable. He brought Omega to council meetings, introduced her to foreign dignitaries, and made it clear she wasn't a passing fancy. When nobles objected, he shut them down with icy precision. Omega understands the kingdom's history better than anyone in this room, he announced during one particularly tense council session. Her insights into our ancient treaties and alliances are invaluable. Anyone questioning her presence is questioning my judgment. The threat was implicit. Cross her, and you cross me. But the opposition grew more sophisticated. Lady Seraphina convinced several council members that the king's attachment to a mortal was clouding his political judgment, making him weak. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Descript Professor Mira had been digging through the deepest archive vaults, searching for precedent for mortal-immortal unions. What she found instead was a fragment of prophecy that Elder Magnus, the kingdom's oldest living scholar, authenticated as genuine. When the Eternal One finds the catalyst of seasons, Mira read aloud to Omega and Theon. The curse of solitary power shall meet its balance. She who understands endings will teach he who knows none. Together they shall bridge the chasm between fleeting and forever, and from their union shall spring wisdom that neither possesses alone. Elder Magnus nodded, his ancient hands trembling as he examined the text. This was written during the First Age before your curse began, Your Majesty. It's not just precedent, it's destiny. The revelation shifted the political landscape. Prophecy held weight in the kingdom, and even Lady Seraphina couldn't argue against authenticated ancient text. Omega wasn't just acceptable, she was foretold. But acceptance wasn't universal, and opposition took darker forms. The crisis came from the eastern border. JXT Group Lord Varen, a power-hungry noble with territorial ambitions, fabricated evidence of treaty violations and demanded reparations that would trigger war if denied. He'd calculated carefully. With Theon distracted by his mortal relationship, the kingdom would be vulnerable, slow to respond. The council erupted into chaos. Half, though, demanded immediate military response. The other half urged negotiation, fearing Varen's alliances would drag neighboring kingdoms into prolonged conflict. Theon stood at the center of the storm, 3 centuries of strategic experience warring with the realization that this threat directly targeted his moment of happiness. War would consume him, pull him back into the Beast King role he'd tried to shed, and destroy everything he'd built with Omega. We mobilize, he said finally, his voice hard. If Varen wants war, We'll give him one he'll never forget. The council moved to execute his orders, but Omega stood frozen, staring at the documents spread across the war table. Something about Varen's claims tugged at her memory, a footnote in an obscure treaty she'd translated months ago. Wait, she said quietly. The room ignored her. She said it louder. Wait. Theon turned, and the room fell silent. The Treaty of Ashwood Vale, Omega said, her mind racing. Signed 400 years ago, between the Eastern Lords and the Crown. There's a clause, a specific clause about territorial disputes that requires arbitration by historical precedent before any military action can be legally justified. She moved to the table, spreading out a map. Varen's claim is based on a border established 200 years ago, but the Ashwood Treaty predates that by 2 centuries and defines different boundaries. If we invoke the treaty, his entire legal foundation collapses. He can't claim violation of agreements that are superseded by older, still valid law. Elder Magnus leaned forward, excitement in his voice. She's right. The Ashwood Treaty was never formally dissolved. It's still binding. Theon looked at Omega with something like awe. Can you prove this? I can have the documentation ready by tomorrow morning, she said, complete with translations and historical authentication. Varen's allies won't support a war if the legal justification is fraudulent. The room erupted in relieved conversation. No war, no bloodshed, just ironclad historical proof that invalidated the threat entirely. Omega worked through the night, translating and cross-referencing treaties with a speed and precision that left the court scholars in awe. By dawn, she'd assembled an irrefutable historical case that Elder Magnus and 3 other independent scholars verified. Descript. When the documentation was presented to Varen's representatives, the Eastern Lord's entire strategy crumbled. His allies withdrew support. His claims were exposed as fraudulent, and the kingdom that had teetered on the edge of war stepped back into stability without a single sword drawn. The council's respect for Omega transformed overnight. She wasn't just the king's mortal fascination. She was the scholar who'd saved them from war, using nothing but knowledge and precision. You were right, Theon told her in the quiet aftermath. The prophecy was right. Your understanding of endings, of mortality, of how things conclude, gave you wisdom I never could have accessed alone. You didn't just prevent war. You showed the kingdom what true power looks like. Lady Seraphina's opposition evaporated. Even the harshest nobles had to acknowledge that Omega had proven her worth in ways no political marriage ever could. The narrative shifted completely. The Beast King's choice wasn't weakness. It was strategy. The mortal archivist wasn't an interloper. She was exactly the queen they needed. 3 months later, Theon brought Omega back to the garden alcove where they'd first truly talked. CBR. The night-blooming flowers were in full display, and stars stretched across the sky like diamonds on velvet. Theon took both her hands, and for the first time since she'd met him, she saw nervousness in his ancient eyes. For 300 years, I've ruled alone, he said quietly. I convinced myself it was safer that way, that isolation was strength, but you've taught me that strength without connection is just survival, not living. You've made me want to live again, Omega. Fully, completely, for however much time we're given. He knelt. The immortal Beast King knelt before the commoner archivist and pulled out a ring carved with intertwining runes. These symbols are in old lycan, he said. I wanted you to read them first, to understand what I'm asking before I say the words. Omega's hands trembled as she examined the ring. The runes read, knowledge is force, love is power. Together we are infinite, even in finite time. Tears blurred her vision. Theon, marry me, Omega, he said simply. Not because prophecy demands it, not because politics requires it, but because I choose you. Every day, for every day we have. Will you choose me too? Yes, she whispered. Yes. Absolutely yes. The wedding was simple by royal standards, held under the stars in that same garden, witnessed by people who actually mattered to them rather than political necessity. Omega wore her mother's embroidered silk. Theon wore traditional northern ceremonial armor, TV tropes. When Elder Magnus blessed their union, he spoke the prophecy aloud, and everyone present understood they were witnessing not just a marriage, but destiny fulfilling itself. The runes Omega had designed were carved into the fortress gates. Knowledge is force, love is power. They became the kingdom's new motto. In the year that followed, Omega transformed the royal archives into a public library, opening knowledge to anyone who sought it, regardless of birth or status. She established councils that brought common scholars alongside noble advisors. She proved repeatedly that wisdom came not from immortality or bloodlines, but from dedication and intellect. Descript Theon ruled differently with her beside him, less isolated, more connected, balancing his centuries of experience with her fresh perspectives and understanding of how mortal lives actually worked. Together, they became partners in every sense: political, intellectual, and personal. The Beast King and his catalyst. The immortal and the mortal. Choosing to build something meaningful, knowing it couldn't last forever but would matter completely while it did. On quiet nights, they still returned to that garden alcove, and Theon would remind Omega how she'd walked into his centuries-long loneliness and turned it into connection. "You know what the cruelest part of immortality is?" he told her once, holding her close under the stars. "Not living forever. It's living. Forever alone. Convinced that's all you deserve. You saved me from that, Omega. Not just that night at the banquet. Every day since. She'd learned the hard way that the worst night of your life could become the doorway to the best chapter. That humiliation could pivot into destiny. That being discarded could actually mean being freed to find where you truly belonged. Sometimes the fairy tale doesn't save you from the beast. Sometimes the beast saves you from believing you're not worth saving. Did you fall for this legend of the Beast King and his mortal queen? Then you need to hit that subscribe button right now and activate notifications, because this story is far from over. Part 2 is coming, and trust me, you won't believe what we're revealing about Theon's curse, how it really began, and what price immortality actually demands. The prophecy wasn't complete, and the real test of their love is just beginning. Drop a comment with the word moon if you want part 2 of this saga. Let me know what you thought. Are you Team Omega? Do you believe in prophecy? Have you ever had a moment where your worst night became your best turning point? Subscribe, smash that like button, and get ready. The Beast King's full story is darker and more beautiful than you imagine, and Omega's greatest challenge is still ahead.